this is a sociology course. Sociology is basically the study of society. So far, we've talked about the major perspectives for analyzing society, the three core perspectives: functionalism, conflict, and interactionism. And what I call the critical perspectives: feminism and postmodernism. We then went over some research methods for collecting and interpreting data about society, namely quantitative and qualitative research methods. We're all the way to lecture 13, and we've neglected probably the most important thing. What exactly is a society? Wait, what? A society's a society. Everybody knows what a society is. It's common sense. That's true. It is common sense. But what did I tell you about common sense notions back in, lecture 1? The whole point of sociology is to challenge common sense notions. To properly exercise one's sociological imagination, we really can't take anything for granted. So we're not going to. But society is a tough thing to define. Even sociologists are not really consistent. For instance, many introduction to sociology textbooks don't even bother to define society. Max Weber, the Grand Master himself, wrote a 2-volume tome called Economy and Society, summarizing his substantial theories on society. He never defined society. It's right there in the title. Weber famously defined everything. The volume begins with sociological definitions, in which he even defines the word meaning, but no specific definition of society. Other texts are inconsistent. This is my very first sociology text from college, way back when I was 19. No, it's not written on clay tablets. But anyway, Massionis defines society as people who interact with one another within a limited territory and who share a culture. Of course, this was before the internet. Newman, on the other hand, defines society as a population living in the same geographic area that shares a culture and a common identity, and whose members are subject to the same political authority. This is a pretty common definition, but it's problematic when you consider, say, American society. This is a huge geography full of many different cultures. And Kornblum states that a society is a population that is organized in a cooperative manner to carry out the major functions of life. What is meant by cooperation? Are you in school because you're being cooperative, or are your parents making you go? Is obedience cooperation? And Giddens defines society as a group of people who live in a particular territory, are subject to common system of political authority, and are aware of having a distinct identity from other groups. Well, this one elaborates on an element that I think is important: identity. Look, all of these sociologists have a somewhat different approach to understanding what a society is. I have my own, which is a bit different still, but we should be able to agree on a general definition of what a society is. Society is one of those things that we take for granted. We're born in one, we live in one, we spend our entire lives in one. The concept of society does not really enter our minds until it has to. For instance, when you travel to another country, you become acutely aware of what a society is because now you have to pay attention. When my family and I traveled to China, we had to figure out how to communicate and conduct ourselves. Major disruptions also may happen that bring your society into fine relief. For instance, Hurricane Katrina and more recently Maria were important because they tested our sense of responsibility toward each other and forced us to confront the uncomfortable reality that some members of our society are largely excluded from the benefits. The Great Recession and our national's political response to it raised questions and challenged the very legitimacy of our political economy. The concentration of wealth and the deference that the wealthy receive from our elected officials became problematic, especially when it appeared to be at the expense of everybody else. When the United States invaded Iraq, we received a tragic lesson in what happens when the power structure, even a tyrannical power structure, in a society is removed. Each of these cases forces us to confront and answer questions about our common mutual responsibility toward each other in a given society. They also reveal the cracks and fractures of society and test the limits of relations that hold a society together. A better understanding of these things could help us make better social decisions. So, okay, Mr. Andosha, get off your soapbox, stop preaching, and tell us what society is. All right, calm down. It's not that easy. When we're dealing with a common sense notion, it's best to just start from scratch. For this reason, I like to reference my friend, the confused Martian. My Martian friend over here has no preconceived notions about the human world. It's my job to explain even the most basic concepts to him, and he's very logical, rational, and inquisitive. He's really a little annoying, come to mention it. So how might we describe a society to a Martian who has no idea what a society is? Well, we might start with trying to figure out what all the other definitions have in common. So, for instance, of the definitions that I've shared, and some others that I've read from many of the texts that I've read, there are some recurring themes. All of these definitions reference, for instance, geographical location. Many sociologists also mention culture when discussing society. In many cases, some form of government or authority is important. And also, many sociologists recognize that society overlaps with identity. All of this makes sense. When we imagine something like American society, we often see a map of the United States. Well, no, it's complicated. One thing at a time. We can also imagine what we mean by American culture. When we think about American culture, some symbolic representations come to mind. The flag, blue jeans, rock and roll music, apple pie, hamburgers, baseball, Uncle Sam, the 4th of July. We also imagine a government represented, for better or worse, by the president as an American authority that people who consider themselves American are answerable to. Furthermore, being an American becomes a part of our identities. We imagine that who we are is related to the geography, culture, and legal authority where we live. When my family and I were in China, we still carried with us our identities as being American, even though we were in a different geography under a different authority. And this became an obvious reference point. We were Americans, and that fact entered into the Chinese imaginations of who we were and how people were to interact with us. So it's fair to say that societies are constructed with all 4 of these elements. But here's the confusing part, Mr. Martian. If you were paying attention to my descriptions, you might have noticed the recurrence of a certain term: imagine. We define our society and societies in general based on what we imagine to be true for members of such a society, including ourselves. That's why Benedict Anderson, in his study of nationalism, declares that societies are imagined communities. For the most part, when we talk about American society or any society, we're likely imagining the same thing. We understand that there is a difference between living north of the 49th parallel and living south of the 49th parallel. There's no real physical boundary, but we know because of historical, legal, and cultural precedent that the first is the society known as Canada, and the other is the society known as the United States. This is an example of everyone having a consensus about the boundaries of a society. Where we have a consensus about society, things run pretty smoothly. It's always in the interest of society to develop a social consensus about the rules of living in that society. Sometimes, however, there isn't a consensus. When there's no consensus, we have conflict. Take, for instance, our current debate over immigration. This is an issue that cuts across a very foundational understanding of society, namely, who are members and who are not. If we define a society based on geography and political authority, are we saying that everyone within those boundaries and subject to that authority are full members of society? Well, at least in the United States, no, we're not. In the United States, we have a tradition of birthright citizenship that was codified into law in 1868 with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. People who are not born in the United States who wish to become members can go through a process called naturalization. This is, in essence, a ritual performed to be recognized as a member or a citizen of a society, with all of the benefits and responsibilities that the society offers. More or less, we as a society agree on what constitutes a citizen, but not completely. Some are starting to question even birthright citizenship, while others believe we should offer fewer opportunities for naturalization. But there's less consensus about those who do not fit our definition of citizen. How should American society respond to non-citizens? Should they be allowed to freely enter our society and participate as if they were full members? Should they be allowed in with limited benefits? Should only a certain amount be allowed? Or should we be selective about who comes in? Should they be completely excluded? If so, how much energy should be put into keeping them out? If we're going to exclude or limit entry, what about people who sneak in? How do we deal with people who are technically breaking the law by crossing our boundary, but otherwise participate in perfectly legal and even beneficial market activities like farming, domestic work, or unpleasant factory labor? What if they're in the United States for many years without incident? Can they earn some benefits, or is their membership defined by one act of crossing a border which is largely imaginary anyway? What if they have children while in the United States? Those children are, by law and tradition, members of our society, but the parents are not. What about people who sneak in with young children who live their whole lives in the United States, who identify with American culture despite not being born in the United States, or going through a requisite ritual to establish membership? No matter how you feel about these questions, and I certainly have my opinions, they're all matters for which we as members of the United Statesian society do not have a consensus. And this is a foundational issue of any society. Who gets to be recognized as a member? Where there's conflict, we have to figure out how to create a consensus. Such conflicts are perfectly natural in any society. Societies usually come up with ways to argue and to decide on matters like this that are recognized as more or less legitimate. Often we agree about these things in the political sphere and decide on laws to guide our actions. Sometimes we argue about these things in the less formal cultural sphere, in which case we develop traditions and norms that guide our actions. This usually works pretty well, but sometimes these conflicts lead to polarization or divisions within the society in which there can't be a compromise. When the consensus breaks down, this can lead to animosity, violence, even civil war. So, to a certain extent, we can define a society as an ongoing negotiation on the rules that should guide the lives of recognized members. This understanding of society as a negotiation is central to my approach to studying society. As you can imagine, the more people you have in a society, the more complicated this negotiation becomes. Yet, in most issues, societies do this pretty well. It's easy to look at the conflict and think that everything is coming apart at the seams, but think about it. I can go from my home in South Florida all the way across the country, thousands of miles, to, say, Seattle, Washington, and I'll be able to get around just fine. I'll largely know the rules to follow, the language to use, the symbols to interpret. The negotiation has already taken place. I'll be perfectly comfortable. On the other hand, if I were to travel just about 100 miles away to Cuba, I'll have a more difficult time because I'll have to learn how to negotiate my own way through a society in which I'm not familiar. These boundaries may be imaginary, but they're very real in their consequences. So how does this happen? I don't know anybody in Seattle. How is it I can travel there and get along just about as easily as I get along in my own hometown? The United States is a society of over 325 million people. And on most things that organize our lives, we largely agree. How does that happen? Well, that's the beauty of societies. As they grow and develop, they create social structures to meet the needs of the society. In a word, these social structures are socially constructed. We learned about social construction theory, I guess, in lecture 7. In essence, social structures are defined and predictable patterns of behavior within a given social context. I'm a teacher at a school in Southwest Florida. If I were to move and teach in a school in Seattle, despite the distance and all of the geographical differences, I would understand my role as a teacher and be able to predict what that interaction would be like. Schools are social structures. Social structures consist of norms, roles, and statuses. Norms are rules for participating within a given structure. These rules may be formal, in that they're written down with clear consequences, or informal rules for group interaction. Roles are the expected behaviors and responsibilities of each member of the interaction. For instance, as a teacher, the role I play in the interaction that takes place in the social structure called a classroom is defined differently than the role defined as student. Status defines who receives deference from others and privileges that others do not have. So, for instance, in a classroom, my status and my role as a teacher gives me the power to give grades that are meaningful to the student. Students don't get to grade me in quite the same way. Many of the behaviors and interactions that take place within a social structure are ritualized, and many of the ways we communicate are scripted. The whole point of having a structure is to create a stable set of expectations in which to act, in which individuals are not expected to innovate behaviors or renegotiate interactions. When you start looking at the rituals in your life, you start to see them everywhere. From waking up in the morning and preparing to go to school to the routines that we have at night when we go to bed, there are relatively few interactions that are not ritualized in some way or scripted in some way. Imagine how difficult it would be if every time we entered into an interaction, we had to figure out the rules of that interaction. Structures make it possible to conduct most interactions almost automatically. I meet you, I say hello, you say hello, how are you? I say fine, how are you? You say, I'm doing great, and walk on. Everyone's happy. That's an example of a scripted ritual. Imagine how that would have to transpire if there was no script to define that interaction. So where do these structures come from, and what do they do? Well, that depends on how you look at social structures. You've learned the major sociological perspectives, and each of them have a somewhat different approach to studying social structures. So, for instance, the functionalist sociologists see social structures as providing order and stability to society. Structures are functional and serve to order and organize our lives in such a way that makes social life possible. Social structures are organic to society itself, hence the organic model. As society evolves, so do its component structures. Functionalists have a positive interpretation of social structures. Well, this contrasts with conflict theorists. For conflict theorists, social structures are imposed by dominant groups onto less powerful groups. The social structures serve to preserve dominant groups at the top of the social hierarchy. The best example of this is Marx's concept of the superstructure. Marx saw society as resting on economic foundations presided over by an economic elite, in this case, the capitalist class. The economic elite uses its wealth to fund and finance other structures like the state, education, religion, and culture. These structures form a superstructure that supports the legitimacy of the economic elite. This superstructure teaches the proletariat from the soapbox, from the classroom, or the pulpit that capitalism is the right and natural way to run a society. For Marx, this superstructure creates an alienating false consciousness that keeps the proletariat from rising against their oppressors. The functionalists and the conflict theorists are very interested in structure. They have a top-down understanding of society, what we call a macro-level approach. That's why they're understood as being structuralist approaches to sociology. The interactionists, however, flip the script on social structures. Instead of understanding social structures from the top down, the interactionists understand structures as the products of interaction. In fact, some symbolic interactionists even reject the validity of structures completely. Only interactions matter. The theory of the social construction of reality explains structures as habitual interactions, or interactions that have been repeated so many times that they become understood as the right and natural way of doing things. They become accepted reality. Probably the most comprehensive theory from this tradition is Anthony Giddens' theory of structuration. For Giddens, social structures are composed of rules that reproduce the structures and resources that allow those within the structures to get things done. Giddens sees social structures as having a dual nature, which he refers to as the duality of structure. Structures are the medium by which things get done, and structures are the outcome of doing these things. So, for instance, your school has resources like books, computers, and teachers, as well as rules like a curriculum that are recognized as an education. Schools are the medium by which you receive an education. But schools are also the outcome as they become recognized structures for getting an education. When people want an education, they seek out schools. They don't go to the public library. The critical perspectives also have somewhat different approaches to understanding structure. The feminist perspective, for instance, sees structures in much the same way as conflict theorists, as an imposition. In this case, however, the structures are created by men to benefit men and to maintain a system ruled by, you guessed it, men. Male-dominated societies are called patriarchies, and their structures are patriarchal. The postmodernists have a very radical approach to social structures. Postmodernists claim that social structures can be deconstructed into meta-narratives, or the way we talk about things. So when we talk about our education, our personal education narratives, it's understood that we're referencing the process that we all went through in school. These meta-narratives are not constants. They change over time. Once upon a time, our education was a product of our family lives, our apprenticeships, or personal networks. But today the narrative defines education in terms of school. And it doesn't have to. We could recognize education in terms of going to the public library and reading all of the books. In the future, education may be defined in terms of the internet and virtual reality. The bottom line is that for postmodernists, structures are not permanent definable things. Furthermore, postmodernists recognize that the traditional structures or meta-narratives are becoming less influential and definitive in our lives. Instead, we're increasingly develop our own personal narratives. If these narratives are being influenced by larger social forces, they're the media, technology, and the consumer marketplace rather than the traditional sources of religion, traditional culture, and the state. Now, social structures are probably the most broad category of concern for sociologists. Remember, the sociologist is interested in how these structures influence human behavior and interaction. Another way of describing social structures is as structured human behavior. Imagine a society like the United States with over 325 million people all doing their own thing. The society known as the United States would not be possible. Imagine just driving down the street. Well, there wouldn't even be a street. There would be no rules or conduct or structures to constrain what you did in your car or what anybody else did in their car. Would you ever make it home from a party? Human behavior must be structured in order to accomplish anything. Social structure describes how human behavior is organized within a society. But how are they organized? What do these structures look like? For all practical purposes, social structures are organized first into institutions. Institutions are pretty much the workhorses of society. They are social structures dedicated to meeting the needs of society, such as securing resources, socializing the young, distributing power, or whatever else you can think of. For sociologists, these are the structural building blocks of society. The major institutions in society include the family, the state, the market, religion, education, the military, healthcare, and the media. We could also probably include recreation and leisure. For the most part, institutions are the social structures primarily responsible for satisfying what sociologist Talcott Parsons refers to as functional prerequisites of society. In other words, in order for societies to thrive, according to Parsons, they must find ways to fulfill four functions, represented by the acronym AGILE. First is adaptation. Societies must find ways to adapt to the physical environment. This is done by acquiring, developing, and distributing resources. The economic system is largely responsible for this requirement. Second is goal attainment. Societies must meet the needs of individuals and groups within the society to set and achieve their goals. Societies must also find ways to deal with any resulting conflicts when there are discrepancies between individuals and groups in pursuit of these goals. Government, or what Parsons refers to as the polity, takes on this task. Third is integration. Societies must find ways to get all of its members and constituent groups to work together. They must develop a sense of solidarity. Our social systems like family, education, are central to this particular goal. Finally is what Parsons refers to as latent pattern maintenance, or your textbook might refer to as latency. Latency refers to the need for societies to be stable. This is done by the creation of shared values, which is carried out by the cultural system. For Parsons, this meant religion, but I think we could add mass media to this analysis as well. Institutions are responsible for meeting the needs of society. To meet these needs, institutions must structure human behavior and interaction in such a way that guarantees this outcome. How do institutions do this? Well, there are both formal and informal ways of organizing human behavior and interaction within social groups. Most social groups are informal. When people interact on a more or less regular basis and consciously recognize themselves or can be identified as members, they have formed a social group. A great deal of an individual's life is taken up negotiating acceptance into and roles and statuses within social groups. We all belong to multiple social groups, each with different expectations from us as individuals. So our family, our peer groups, those we work with, the band we're members of, the church we attend, all of these are social groups. The smallest social group is what German sociologist George Simmel called a dyad. Dyads are social groups of only two people. A marriage or the relationship between BFFs is an example of a dyad. Dyads are intrinsically meaningful but often unstable. If one person in the dyad leaves, no more dyad. The next step up from a dyad is, of course, a triad. This is a group of 3 people. Think of a band, a lead guitar, rhythm, and a drummer. Triads are intrinsically more stable than our dyads. Say the drummer leaves the band. The band is still a band. They can just find another drummer. Triads are also the smallest social unit in which a coalition can form. A coalition is a subgroup composed of members who join together in opposition to another subgroup. In a triad, it's possible for the rhythm and lead guitarist to conspire against the drummer. Groups can also be divided into primary and secondary groups. Primary groups tend to be long-term groups that are emotionally oriented, held together by personal bonds. Think about families or peer groups. Your crazy Uncle Henry may not be someone you would normally hang around with, but hey, what are you going to do? He's family. Secondary groups tend to be short-term and are task-oriented. Think about the people you work with or volunteer groups or classrooms. These groups come together for a particular purpose, and that purpose is what binds the group. When the task is done, say you've finished the curriculum for a particular class, the group comes to an end. Secondary groups are more likely to be formally organized. Groups that are structured through formal, often legal processes for a specific purpose are called organizations. Organizations have certain characteristics. First, in organizations there is a clear, well-defined hierarchy. All groups have leaders, but in organizations there's a formal process for understanding who the leader is and formally defined benefits to being the leader. In most business organizations, for instance, you'll have a CEO and other executive officers. Below them are managers who may have supervisors working under them who are in direct oversight of the workers. This is what is meant by a hierarchy. Everyone knows who's in charge and who to go to for particular needs. Organizations also have a formal division of labor. This division of labor for larger organizations takes the form of a bureaucracy. When we think about the word bureaucracy, we often think of the state. But all large organizations have a bureaucracy. They have to in order to function. The bureaucracy is a formal division of labor designed to increase the efficiency of fulfilling the function of the organization. Each function is broken down into its elemental tasks, and these tasks are relegated to individuals who become experts at that particular task. The most immediate organization that everyone watching this video is familiar with is your school. Your school is an organization responsible for providing a formal education process. Your principal is in charge and delegates the job of running the school to vice principals. Some vice principals are in charge of the curriculum. One is in charge of the school building. One is in charge of special education, discipline, etc. Guidance counselors help students navigate the issues that arise in their lives and planning for the future. Teachers present the curriculum according to departments, language arts, math, social studies, science, etc. Maintenance staff and janitors take care of the building. Secretaries, paraprofessionals do the office tasks. There are a lot of people involved in running a school. These people and tasks are organized into a bureaucracy. Then, take a look at where you live and all the schools in your district. My school district has over 90,000 students. That's about the population of Dearborn, Michigan. It would be impossible to teach that many students without some serious organization going on. Of course, the foundational element of all societies is individuals. Society can be seen as the environment in which individuals interact. As individuals, we interact within and between many social groups. Think about all the social groups you're a part of. You're a part of your family. Your family may be subdivided into your siblings, your nuclear family, your extended family, your cousins. Then you go to your bus stop. If there's more than one person there, there's a social group. You get on the bus. That's a social group. You may have people who you sit with regularly. The back of the bus may be a separate social group from the rest of the bus. You go to your first period class, second period class. You have lunch with your friends. You participate in clubs. You're a part of a sports league. You may have a job. The fact that people move from one group to another group is an important feature in society. In doing so, human societies are composed of social groups that are held together by networks. Networks are relationships that we have that connect us to other people in other social groups whom we don't even know. These networks help us gain access to resources we otherwise would not have. Need tickets to the Yankees game on Friday, but they're sold out? Don't worry. I know a guy. You don't know the guy, but through me, this guy is going to help you get to the game. You're welcome. It's networks that are most influenced by modern communication technology. I look out on my school's courtyard and what do I see? Students are grouped much the same way my classmates were grouped when I went to high school. No, it wasn't in a cave. Anyway, students carry on conversations and joke around just like always, but now, with cell phones, these same students are also networked beyond the courtyard. I'd like to think that there might be a social group in my South Florida school courtyard gathered before the bell rings, and because of the cell phone, that group is networked with another similar group of students gathered in, maybe New York, waiting for their bell to ring. Either way, social networking via the internet is really challenging our concepts of society and interaction. A final feature of society is communities. Communities are social groups through which an individual derives a sense of identity. A community may be based on locality. People who live in, say, Queens, share an identity and fellowship with others who live in Queens. That's a community. A community may also be a reference to a larger social category, such as a profession or social movement. As a sociologist, I derive a sense of identity and recognition among other sociologists. Mets fans form a community among sports lovers. So, there it is, Mr. Martian. I've just given you a description of a society in a nutshell. It could be said that a society is a collection of networked social groups that share a perceived affinity and collective identity based on geography, shared culture, and answerable to a common authority. But it's hard to break the term society down into simple terms. After all, everything that I mentioned in this lecture will be elaborated on in later lectures. This is what makes sociology challenging and fun. Even the most central concept of our discipline cannot be taken for granted and is subject to scrutiny. Anyway, the next lecture will deal with socialization and how sociologists address the nature-nurture question. See you next time.